I think you're going to remember today, it's going to be a free nation that we're dealing with. We're going to have a very free and beautiful nation. It's going to be Liberation Day in America, and it's going to be a day that hopefully you're going to look back in years to come and you're going to say, you know, he was right. This has turned out to be one of the most important days in the history of our country.
Once upon a time, America proudly called itself the industrial heartland of the world. Factories hummed around the clock, workers received steady wages, and cities grew up around factories and machine tools. But now, instead of the sounds of assembly lines, all you hear is the wind whistling through empty production halls. Everything has changed, and it's not the global crisis, the pandemic, or even competitors from Asia that are to blame. The reason lies in a decision made in Washington itself.
And police in Italy are investigating possible arson after a fire destroyed more than a dozen Tesla vehicles. Elon Musk is calling the incident at a Rome dealership terrorism. This comes as Tesla has been the target of recent protests around the world.
In 2018, tariffs were imposed on imported aluminum. The policy was presented from the outset as a patriotic act, protection of jobs.
After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
Revival of domestic production. America's returned to its pedestal as an industrial power. But just a few years have passed, and today we stand amid the ruins of those promises. Ford is losing $1.5 billion a year. Plants in Missouri and Indiana are closing.
There's been a lot of on and off, some inconsistency.
There's no inconsistency. I'm not like a block that just, I won't delay. It's called flexibility. It's not called inconsistency. It's called flexibility.
Breweries in North Carolina are laying off employees because even aluminum cans are now a luxury. The price of one can is up 4 cents. It seems like a small amount, but multiply that by 1 million and you're looking at $40,000 less per year. For small businesses, that's the death knell.
US President Donald Trump has announced a 25% tariff on all car and light truck imports into the country. It's due to come into effect on April 2nd. Economists and world leaders are warning that it will be a tax on consumers and have a chilling effect on the global economy. But to Americans, Trump paints a rosy picture, predicting that the levies will spur growth.
Now imagine this, the largest aluminum plant in the southern United States is simply shut down. 500 people out of work. Why? Because imports have been cut off and domestic production is insufficient. Because Canada, which has been our reliable supplier for decades, has suddenly been declared an economic enemy. And yet they have cheap electricity, stable supply chains, and, unlike us, they don't shoot themselves in the foot for the sake of slogans.
Ready? The higher the tariff, the more likely it is that the company will come into the United States and build a factory in the United States so it doesn't have to pay the tariff.
That will take many, as you know, that will take many years.
In fact, I'll tell you, there's another theory is that the tariff, you make it so high, so horrible, so obnoxious that they'll come right away. When I do the 10%, 10% is really, first of all, 10% when you collect it is hundreds of billions of dollars. The numbers that you're talking, all reducing our deficit. But really, so there's two ways of looking at a tariff. You can do it as a money-making instrument, or you can do it as something to get the companies. Now, if you want the companies to come in.
A worker in Illinois says, I'm firing my cousin and my school friend. I can't explain to them that it's not my fault. It's just that aluminum has become twice as expensive. Factories are moving to Mexico. Startups are fleeing to Canada. And we still believe that high tariffs are protection, not self-destruction.
That's a 10. That's a good one.
This video is not about politics, it's not about parties, it's not even about Trump. It's a story about how one decision, made out of patriotism, destroyed the economies of dozens of states. We'll tell you about real people who lost everything, about real numbers that no one wanted to admit, about how a tariff introduced for strength turned into weakness.
with Elon Musk's views on weighing into very much national politics, national elections in Europe. And then on top of that, when you see the backdrop of Tesla upgrading its product line and the impact of them trying to chase more sales at the back end of last year, that means it's short on inventory. It can't necessarily sell as many vehicles or doesn't have as many in stock to sell. So there is that issue there of a confluence of impacts, which means that sales have been falling. Again, the question is how much more that will impact into February as well, given that the back end of last year in 2024, Tesla sales did slip overall.
Are you ready to learn how America is losing its industrial war not to China or the EU, but to itself? Then watch until the end. Because this story is not just about metal, it's about the price each of us pays.
After weeks of whiplash, Trump threatening tariffs, imposing some, and walking back others, many Americans are feeling the uncertainty. In Swisher, Iowa, distillery owner Jeff Quint says it's paralyzing.
The bourbon industry is going to be collateral damage in this tariff war. I don't really think there's any way around that.
And he's not alone. Tonight, the majority of Americans, 61%, now say they disapprove of how the president is handling tariffs. 56% say they disapprove of his handling of the economy overall. But the president has dismissed those concerns tonight, saying he has the right to change course.
It all started with a simple idea to protect America, to make it great again. When the White House announced a 10% tariff on imported aluminum in 2018, it was accompanied by solemn speeches about the revival of American industry. "We will no longer allow other countries to undermine our economy," was the rallying cry. But the reality turned out to be less heroic. In the first few months after the tariff was introduced, major corporations began to feel the pressure. Ford and General Motors recalculated their budgets and announced cost increases. Ford alone spent $1.2 billion more on aluminum than it had a year earlier. But that was just the beginning. Soon the blow fell on those who were more vulnerable: local workers. In the small town of New Madrid, Missouri, stood one of the most modern aluminum plants in the country, Brightmetal Corp, built in the early 2000s with an investment of $300 million. It employed nearly 600 residents, and its tax contributions covered half of the county's budget. The plant survived the 2008 recession and kept its employees on during the pandemic, but it did not survive the tariff war. By 2019, the plant was already operating at half capacity. By 2021, it was closed. The official version was temporary shutdown due to global price volatility. But everyone understood that with raw materials up a third in price, orders were starting to flow to Mexico and Canada, where production costs are lower.
We begin with the president's trade war escalating tonight. This evening, the retaliation against the United States, Canada, and the European Union responding quickly, just hours after President Trump's 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States. Canada, the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., slapping new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods that are sold in Canada. And the 27 countries of the European Union imposing retaliatory tariffs on up to $28 billion worth of U.S. goods sold in Europe.
All that remained in New Madrid was a rusty sign and a line of 500 unemployed people at the local employment center. Among them was Rick Marshall, a former equipment maintenance engineer. For 17 years, he came to the plant at 6:45 a.m., drank coffee from his thermos, and fired up the furnaces. He never missed a day of work. His son was in college and his wife taught a pottery class at a school. After the plant closed, Rick became a truck driver and now drives around the Midwest hauling cargo. He says that what kills him most about his new life is not the fatigue, but the thought that he has become useless to his country. He doesn't understand why they are imposing a tax if they are going to buy aluminum from the same Chinese anyway, just indirectly, through Vietnam, but at a price that is 50% higher. The American aluminum industry was indeed in decline long before the tariffs. Between 2000 and 2017, primary aluminum production in the US fell by 77%, and the number of plants dropped from 23 to 5. The main reasons were high energy costs and outdated facilities. The hope was to import aluminum, especially from Canada, which covered 44% of US aluminum needs, while supplying environmentally friendly metal produced at hydroelectric power plants in Quebec. But after the tariffs were introduced in 2018, supplies began to decline. Instead, the US began buying aluminum from the United Arab Emirates, India, and even Russia, despite political tensions. It seemed absurd Canada, the closest ally, was hit by tariffs, while exporters from autocratic countries benefited. In Missouri, this was felt acutely. The city of Jackson, home to another aluminum plant, Southern Frame Works, was famous throughout the state for its line of aluminum parts for trucks and construction. In 2022, orders fell by 60%. The company's owner, 68-year-old John Haley, tried to keep production going by putting employees on shortened shifts and temporarily cutting wages. But in the fall of 2023, he announced the complete liquidation of the business. The last shift assembled a fire escape frame and went home. "I didn't survive competition from China, but from my own government," Haley said at a farewell meeting. The blow to Missouri was not only economic. The closure of the factories caused the real estate market to collapse, with homes in New Madrid and Jackson falling in price by 23%. Local schools cut extracurricular activities, and the police said they didn't have enough money to patrol rural areas. People started leaving. In 3 years, New Madrid's population dropped by 11%. For a small town, that's a disaster. And it all started with a patriotic economic measure. By the time the federal government realized that the problem extended beyond Missouri, it was too late. In 2024, the U.S. Energy Information Administration published a report acknowledging that domestic aluminum production was unable to meet even 30% of domestic demand. Experts suggested temporarily suspending tariffs or introducing quotas for reliable suppliers such as Canada. But the White House hesitated. Lifting the measures would mean admitting defeat. And with elections looming, that was unthinkable. Against this backdrop, the situation in Canada looked particularly contrasting. Plants in Quebec and British Columbia were operating at full capacity, and exports were growing. Quebec-based Hydronorth even expanded its workforce by hiring 800 additional employees. One of their largest customers in the past was an American corporation that manufactured aluminum profiles for cars. Now the plant has switched to supplying Europe. In a comment to local media, the plant's director said, "America is no longer a reliable customer. They cut themselves off from the market, not us." Thus, the first casualty of the aluminum war is trust. Trust between partners, between workers and the state, between slogans and reality. Missouri is not just a state that has suffered. It is a mirror of the entire situation, when ideology takes precedence over logic, and politicians make economic decisions without regard for the country's real capabilities. Next, the blow came to Illinois, the heart of American manufacturing. Here, in Chicago, Rockford, and Peoria, aluminum was a critical component of production chains. Until 2018, Illinois was home to more than 18,000 manufacturing facilities, employing nearly 600,000 people. Now everything is different. In the first 2 years after the tariffs were introduced, more than 1,500 small manufacturing businesses closed. Some moved to Mexico, others simply disappeared. The market began to be eaten away by an internal paradox. Aluminum from abroad had to be paid for 40% more, but there was still not enough of it domestically. Illinois found itself in the role of a giant with its legs cut off. Stories of workshop owners, laid-off lathe operators and welders, and closed factories became routine. An economy built on predictable supplies and reasonable taxes fell victim to political games. And while Washington argues over symbols, people in Chicago are selling off equipment and writing the good old words on fences for sale. Tools, cheap, cash only. If Missouri and Illinois were the first to feel the effects of aluminum tariffs, Texas and Michigan have become symbols of a deep systemic crack in U.S. industrial strategy. These states are the two pillars that have supported the country's construction and automotive power. One has always been famous for the speed with which it builds skyscrapers, the other for assembling cars that have become a symbol of America. But now, the same rumbling can be heard in both states, not the sound of engines or concrete mixers, but the rumbling of emptiness. Because without affordable aluminum, without stable supplies, and without reasonable government support, this system is simply falling apart. In Houston, the largest construction center in the southern United States, 3 commercial development projects were cancelled in the fall of 2024. The total budget was nearly $1 billion. The official reason was a sharp rise in the cost of construction components, primarily window systems, aluminum facades, and mounting profiles. One developer admitted that the cost of structural aluminum had risen by 18% in just 6 months. This means that with a budget of $80 million, the project loses more than $14 million in net profit just because of metal. And while the private sector can still maneuver, optimize designs, and simplify architecture, government contractors have reached a dead end. Several new schools and municipal buildings in Austin have been put on hold. Suppliers are unable to fulfill contracts at previously agreed prices, and the administration has no right to pay extra from the budget without breaking the law. In some areas, absurd situations have arisen. Wooden panels are being temporarily installed instead of stained glass windows. One contractor said bitterly, "It feels like we're back in 1983. Only the materials cost as much as they will in 2083. Canadian companies, for their part, have not simply continued construction, they have started taking orders from the US. An architectural firm in Toronto has opened an office in Ontario specializing in accepting orders from American clients who find it cheaper to order facades from abroad than to build them domestically. Against this backdrop, it is particularly striking that Texas, one of the richest states with a GDP comparable to Canada's, does not have access to a stable supply chain. When trade policy is shaped in Washington without consulting the regions, even giants like Texas fall victim. One Dallas-based developer said at an industry forum, "We are no longer planning projects with aluminum facades. It's not cost-effective. Even plastic is cheaper. This is not just a decline in architectural quality, it is a lowering of the bar for the entire US construction sector." While some are cutting budgets, others workers are cutting cables to dismantle closed construction sites so they can at least sell the metal for scrap. At the same time, in the North Michigan, once the engine of America has begun to stall. And we're not just talking about a decline in car production, but a whole chain of related industries, from casting to transport logistics. The city of Flint, which survived a water crisis, is now facing an aluminum crisis. The CEO of Midland Forge, a supplier of pickup truck frames, announced in December 2024 that the company was forced to close a third of its production lines. The reason? The cost of assembling a single aluminum frame had risen by $190, and General Motors simply stopped ordering them. The amount does not seem catastrophic, but with 200,000 frames produced per year, this represents tens of millions in losses. Assembly plants in Detroit began to switch to a day-off schedule, with the work week reduced to 4 days and many employees transferred to temporary contracts. In January 2025, according to unofficial data, about 8,000 contracts were cancelled in the region. These are not layoffs, but suspension of cooperation, a euphemism for unpaid mortgages, frozen pensions, and broken families. In a Detroit supermarket, a cashier, recognizing a former factory worker among her customers, said, "You're coming in more often now." He replied, "Yes, because now I live next door. My house was sold to the bank." Meanwhile, manufacturers in Canada, especially in Ontario, are experiencing growth. State-of-the-art factories receive tax breaks, subsidies for modernization, and supply guarantees. Over the past 2 years, the province has increased its exports of auto parts to the US by 28%. One of the auto giants that previously assembled SUVs in Detroit has moved part of its assembly operations to Windsor spring 2024. The reason is not only cheap labor, as is often presented, but also the absence of tariff pressure and guarantees of aluminum supplies at a stable price. Even if aluminum is 12% cheaper at the level of large-scale production, this difference amounts to tens of millions. Within the US, car manufacturers found themselves in a position where they had almost no choice. They had to either raise car prices and lose market share, or cut costs, which meant laying off staff, moving production abroad, or simplifying designs. As a result, cars are becoming more expensive, but not better. What's more, the average price of a basic pickup truck model in 2025 has risen by $4,200. At the same time, auto industry workers' wages rose by only 2.3% over the same period. This imbalance in the chain from extraction to the end consumer has created a situation in which each next step looks like an attempt to save what is already impossible to hold on to. Michigan, like Texas, was not a victim of global competition, but of internal paradoxes. We tried to lock ourselves in a tariff fortress, but failed to realize that it was empty inside. There is no metal. Production has been cut off, and workers have been laid off. All that remains is pride, and, alas, pride does not support GDP. Today, if you walk through the streets of Detroit, you will see billboards with slogans like "Buy American." The problem is that behind these billboards are closed car dealerships with no one to sell cars to because there is no one to build them. And this is perhaps the most painful illusion of recent years, the belief that slogans can replace strategy. But aluminum, as it turns out, does not bend to slogans. It simply disappears from factories.